Hello, and thank you for tuning in to this week's Memo Weekly Review with me, Naseem Ahmed, and my regular guest, Moin Rabbani. Hi, Moin. Thank you for joining us again.
Thank you for having me, Naseem. A pleasure as always.
So, as usual, we'll begin with the situation in Gaza and the grim report that the death toll in Gaza has surpassed 40,000. We'll pause and reflect on that, comparing the death toll and the destruction to the rate of killing in other conflicts. We'll look at a recent article by a prominent Israeli historian looking at the parallels between the radicalization in Germany, which led to the genocide, and the radicalization that's taking place in Israel at the moment. We'll also speak about Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, who's announced that he will be visiting Gaza soon. No date, as far as I know, has been confirmed, but he has said he's traveling to, he'll visit Gaza. What's that about? And there's been another settler-led pogrom in the West Bank against Palestinians. So we'll look at that and the response of the pogroms in the occupied West Bank, and accusations that Israel is using Palestinians as human shields in Gaza. That's another horrific report that came out last week. We'll discuss that and end with a conversation with US Secretary of State Blinken visiting Israel, situation regarding the ceasefire talks, and also a UK civil servant resigning over the fact that the new Starmer government has not stopped its arms deal with Israel. But let's begin, as I mentioned, with the situation in Gaza, which has passed another grim milestone. 40,000 Palestinians, which is the lowest estimate, have been killed, mainly civilians. More bombs have been dropped in Gaza than Dresden, London, and Berlin combined from the Second World War. The rate and pace of death overshadows all other conflicts, including Ukraine, Myanmar, and many others. In terms of percentage, 2% of the Palestinian population have been killed. So for comparison, 2% of Israel's population is 198,000. The only recent conflict which saw 2% of its civilians killed is Syria. But that killing was over 13 years, whereas in Gaza, it's over 10 months. So those numbers and those conflicts, which I shared with you, Moin, it pales into insignificance when you talk about what is happening in Gaza, despite Israeli claims that this is, in terms of deaths in urban conflicts, Gaza is the same as every other conflict.
Yes, well, let's start with the casualty figure because, of course, Israel and its apologists have repeatedly tried to cast doubt on this and claiming, that the formulation you typically see is Hamas-run health ministry, as if every medic, every nurse, every staff member in any Gaza hospital is somehow a member of Hamas's Politburo. What they don't tell you is that these figures, the figures issued by the Palestinian Health Ministry in Gaza, have proven to be reliable and credible on every previous occasion where they have been examined and subject to detailed testing, if you will, after the end of conflict. And that what they also don't tell you is that the statistics issued by the Palestinian Health Ministry are considered reliable, perhaps not by Israel's Ministry of Propaganda, but they are considered credible and used, in fact, by Israel's intelligence services and by the U.S. intelligence services and by the United Nations and other international organizations and NGOs that are operating in the Gaza Strip. So the figures are beyond doubt. And the reason they're beyond doubt is that for a casualty to enter this list of shame of persons killed by Israeli forces during the current genocide. The name, the identity number, and other identifying information needs to be provided to the Ministry of Health. And until recently, the corpse of the individual concerned would need to be present at a Palestinian hospital as well. And this explains why, as you put it, that is a minimum estimate. It does not include the many thousands who have been buried under the rubble for months and are not only presumed dead, but are certain to be dead. It doesn't include those who have died as a result of the indirect effects of the Israeli campaign against the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. And what recent statistical analysis has demonstrated, as you indicated, is that this is by far the most intense conflict since the Second World War. And the criteria used to make that assessment is the percent of the total population that has been killed and the pace at which they have been killed. So while you certainly have other conflicts, such as Vietnam or more recently Syria, where the casualty figures have been significantly higher, it does not approach either the same percentage of the population or that percentage being reached at such a rapid pace as has been the case in the Gaza Strip. So it kind of puts the definitive lie to all those who are either claiming, that civilians are what can legitimately be described as collateral damage, meaning that Israel was actually aiming for a military target, and the civilians unfortunately got in the way. I think it demonstrates quite clearly that it is the civilian population of the Gaza Strip that is the primary target of Israel's military campaign, and that it is the primary target on a systematic basis, month after month after month, now for almost a year, because there can be no other explanation for this astonishing scale of killing, of casualties, of systematic destruction throughout the Gaza Strip since October 7th.
One of the things many have asked since is how can such a brutal campaign be prosecuted in this day and age, a genocide being live streamed with the support and the backing of the US. So we have to be honest that this is a US-backed genocide by Israel. And how that can happen. There has to be a level of dehumanization of the Palestinians. And that dehumanization is something that was outlined by an Israeli historian last week, Omar Bartov, in a really well-written article in The Guardian long read. I interviewed Omar actually just, I think in November, 4 or 5 weeks after 7 October. And he pushed back against the idea that Israel was committing genocide, even though another historian, Segal, Ras Segal, said that it was a textbook case of genocide. He pushed back against that. And in this article he published last week, he accepted that Israel is prosecuting a genocide. He conceded that fact. But the main question he was asking is, what motivates soldiers to fight in such a way that they can justify and defend a genocide? And I mean, I found the revelations quite remarkable. I mean, what did you make? I'm assuming you have read the article. What did you make of what did you make of his findings and the concession that he now accepts that it is genocide?
Well, there were several aspects that I found quite telling and worthwhile about that article. The first, as you've indicated, is that he is one of that dwindling group of genocide specialists and scholars of the German Holocaust who have pushed back against the assessment that Israel is actually engaging in genocide and that we have enough evidence and confirmation of this fact that as scholars, as analysts, we don't need to wait another 5 or 10 years for the International Court of Justice to make a formal legal determination about what Israel is doing. For whatever reason, Omer Bartov and a few others have pushed back against this accusation, and he is among the most prominent scholars in this field who have now too revised their assessment and basically made the point, I initially did not accept this that this was a genocide. I can no longer deny that it is. So his article, I think, is worthwhile and worth reading. First of all, for that aspect. Second of all, um, for those who are not intimately familiar with the German Holocaust and the 1940s and World War II and even the run up to it in the 1930s, I think he makes some very telling comparisons between Israeli society today and German society then. How, we obviously think of the Holocaust, where you had Germans systematic, or the German state and its propaganda institutions systematically dehumanizing Jews before then exterminating them by the millions. But what is often forgotten is that a key part of this message was that Germans were the victims uh, of Jews and were therefore, according to Nazi propaganda, acting in self-defense against an existential threat. And Bartov makes the case that this is very closely reflected in what you see in Israeli society today. On the one hand, this thorough and total dehumanization so that you can do to Palestinians what you wouldn't even do to a stray dog because their life is that worthless. But in addition to that, you do it because Israeli propaganda has convinced Israeli society and its soldiers and those who are conducting this genocide, not only that Palestinian life is worthless and undeserving of existing, um, but that the Palestinians as a people, man, woman, and child, form by their very existence an existential threat to Israel, to the Jewish people, and all the rest of it. And I found that very interesting to read, given my lack of intimate familiarity with Germany during the 1940s. And Bartov, of course, is someone who's a world-renowned specialist in this area. And I thought that the comparisons he drew of an Israeli society that has become hysterical, irrational, and so on, and for whom there is nothing that the state can do to the Palestinians that would violate their moral code, I think was a very interesting analogy and observation.
And there's a real sadness in the way he writes about it, I think, because he is an Israeli, he served in the
Yes.
Israeli army, and he felt this is a project endeavor of given my life to, you can say. And as you point out, for him to make that admission in the way he did, I mean, if I can quote him, he says, "Nothing empowers violence more than a righteous sense of victimhood." And he was saying that about German soldiers in the German society, the idea that this war machine can somehow feel victimized and the victim of Jewish propaganda, any kind of propaganda. And he's saying that was the kind of mindset, victimhood mindset, that gripped German society at the time, which led to the Holocaust. And he's basically saying, that there is a sense of victimhood, similar types of victimhood, which has gripped the Israeli public, this war machine in, historic Palestine, that now feels it is the victim of Palestinians, and that for me was the real compelling argument, like you as well.
Yes, yes, and not only the victim of Palestinian attacks, as we saw on October 7th, but the victim of Palestinian existence. The mere fact that this people exists is seen and has been transformed into a permanent existential threat to Israel, the Israeli state, and Israeli society. And it is in that context that we need to understand this genocide.
Mm. Let's move on to another story from last week, which is the announcement by Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, who made the announcement in Turkey that he will be visiting Gaza with members of the Palestinian leadership. So that, I think that came as a surprise to a lot of people. I mean, what's his calculation here? Why is this part of the post-Gaza plan, that he wants to stake his claim that I'm still around? I mean, the PA has really been non-effective. I mean, I don't know what role he's played over the decades. I mean, what is his calculation here?
Well, I would put it this way, Nassim. You and I have probably discussed this issue during the past few months with more often and with greater interest than has Mahmoud Abbas, who's the titular head of the Palestinian people. He has reduced himself to an irrelevant and impotent spectator, and that's being charitable because, of course, many Palestinians see him not just as irrelevant, but as an active collaborator with the Israeli state and with the Israeli occupation, which is particularly egregious during an ongoing genocide. And I think, as you suggested, his announcement, and I would treat it as no more than an announcement that he intends to visit the Gaza Strip, is somehow meant as an assertion of relevance, as an assertion of leadership. I would be very, very surprised if anything actually comes of this announcement. He has been free to visit the Gaza Strip for years. Of course, not in the immediate aftermath of Hamas's seizure of power in the Gaza Strip after 2007, but other senior Fatah leaders and senior PA officials have visited the Gaza Strip. He has had an open invitation to go there himself. He has previously announced an intention to visit, and nothing ever came of it. It's said of Mahmoud Abbas that the two things he most detests are Yasser Arafat and the Gaza Strip. And of course, his mansion in Gaza City, which was even visually offensive, is not going to be returned to him. So I really don't expect him to go. If he does, it will be because the U.S. armed and supplied Israeli military has managed to establish uncontested control over the Gaza Strip, and the Americans and the Europeans will, on the one hand, have compelled Israel to enable the Palestinian Authority to resume administration of the Gaza Strip, and secondly, they will drive him into the Gaza Strip on the back of an Israeli tank, and that's really the only scenario in which I can see Abbas going to the Gaza Strip. And it's also worth noting that he is genuinely detested by the overwhelming majority of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, utterly reviled. Um, including, I would argue, by most of those who also detest or are opposed to Hamas, because it's not a zero-sum game. For many Palestinians who oppose Hamas and who have wanted Hamas's rule of the Gaza Strip to end, they don't see Abbas as a viable alternative, given his complicity, to put it mildly, in the decades of blockade of the Gaza Strip and his complete absence at a time of their greatest need.
I can play devil's advocate for a second. So what kind of leadership, what's the bare minimum of a Palestinian leadership? Now, someone could say Mahmoud Abbas is a genocide in Gaza. What is he supposed to do? How can he visit Gaza? He's between a rock and a hard place. But genuinely asking the question, what are the principal qualities of a nation who is undergoing a genocide? What are the qualities of a leadership that you would require in the case of Palestine?
Well, I think first and foremost, he has to ensure that he or she would need to ensure that they are the legitimate and credible representative of the Palestinian people in its entirety, and leave absolutely no stone unturned to seek to unify the ranks of the Palestinian people and its political forces. And I want to make clear, I'm here referring specifically to Abbas rather than the Fatah movement, because you have had senior leaders of the Fatah movement, along with senior leaders of Hamas and various other Palestinian organizations, achieve formulas for unification, for power sharing on repeated occasions during the past 2 decades. And each and every time, the ultimate obstacle to their implementation has been none other than Mahmoud Abbas. So, first of all, a serious leader would need to ensure that he is a representative of all Palestinians and not only of himself and his cronies and his bagmen. Secondly, such a leader would be screaming at the top of his voice from morning till night on every day of the week, doing everything within their power to focus attention on this genocide, and doing absolutely everything within their power to seek to bring it to an end. There has been absolutely no such effort from Mahmoud Abbas. He is, I would argue, been more critical of Hamas than he has been of Israel since October 7th. Why? Not The issue is not whether those criticisms are legitimate or illegitimate, but because he's looking at it through the very narrow perspective of rivalry with his Palestinian adversaries, rather than nationally, in terms of what could best serve his people in terms of bringing this genocide to a halt.
Let's turn our attention to the West Bank, where we saw another settler-led pogrom against Palestinians. What was interesting for me, the village of Jit, by the way, what was interesting to me is the denunciations, not just from all corners of the world, but also from within Israel as well, and prominent Zionist organizations. Here in the UK, the Board of Deputies condemned it. Yoav Gallant, of all people, the Israeli defense minister, he also condemned it. And he said that at a time when our troops are fighting on the front lines, defending the state of Israel, a group of radical individuals have launched he called it a riot, and attacked innocent people. They do not represent the values of the communities living in not West Bank, Samaria. So that was his response, denouncing the pogrom. I called it an incident or an event. But to me, that the condemnation of the settlers kind of misses the point, because if we really look at Israeli history, the creation of the state of Israel, what we see in the West Bank on a daily basis, the annexation, the pushing out of Palestinians from their farms and their land, is really how Israel was created to begin with. So if Yoav Galan is condemning the settlers for carrying out pogroms against Palestinians in occupied West Bank, that's exactly how Israel was created to begin with, isn't it?
Yes, and I think, that this is a response to those who feel that what we have been seeing at the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court is meaningless and irrelevant. What you have now is senior Israeli leaders, Israel's army of organized apologists in the West, seeking to distance themselves from these pogroms because they realize that there will be consequences for continuing to embrace these people as our finest. And that's particularly true for someone like the Israeli defense minister. But look, you can't give someone who is a fanatic um, an automatic weapon and then go and remove the security guards from the school and give this person a map to the school and then condemn them for shooting up the students in that school. It doesn't work that way. These settlers did not buy their weapons on the black market. They're armed by the Israeli army. They don't have the courage to go to these villages on their own and conduct pogroms. They are sponsored and assisted and accompanied by the Israeli army. And at the first sign of trouble, the Israeli army acts and acts very forcefully, not against the settlers, but against their victims, to ensure that the settlers can do their sordid work. And, these settlers, as you suggested, should be understood first and foremost as the Israeli state's auxiliaries, as a militia working according to the state's agenda in order to implement the state's agenda. And of course, when TV cameras catch what they're doing, they're going to be denounced and, oh, this is not who we are and all the rest of it. Well, it's exactly who they are. They are being armed for a reason. They are being settled in Palestinian territory for a reason. They are being encouraged to conduct these pogroms for a reason. They are being assisted in their pogroms. They're being protected during their pogroms. And those who oppose their pogroms are being arrested and shot and killed for a reason.
I should have noted a great report done by Harrods a couple of years ago showing exactly how the armed illegal terrorizing settlers are working hand in glove with the Israelis. So when now you have someone like Yoav Galant and Zionist organization denouncing and distancing themselves from the settlers when they never used to, you know, that they are actually in cahoots with the settlers in many ways, but just politically inconvenient to now be associated with the
Can I
settlers
just
somehow.
interrupt you? I don't think they're in cahoots with the settlers. I think it's earlier the case of the settlers being in cahoots with them. It's the state that formulates policy and formulates its strategic objectives.
Mm.
It's the state that has renamed the West Bank Judea and Samaria. It's the state that has indicated that annexation of the West Bank is a formal policy and objective. It's the state that has proclaimed intensified settlement to be a strategic objective of the state. So to somehow say, yeah, the real problem here is a few excessively violent settlers, that doesn't fly because they're the ones who are in cahoots with the state.
And we forgot to mention all this is happening, of course, within the context of an ICJ ruling from last month, which
Yeah.
declared that Israel's occupation of West Bank and Gaza is occupied, is illegal. So this is all happening within the context of Israel's illegal occupation. Let's move on to another story from last week. I mean, we've mentioned this phrase many times. Every accusation is a confession. It's become a global meme now. When in the context of Israel, every accusation is a confession. That was something we mentioned with regards to the rape case and many other atrocities that has been taking place. The latest is finding by another Israeli organization breaking the silence of Israeli soldiers using Gazan civilians as human shields. The practice, according to Breaking the Silence, is said to be routine. The soldiers have a name for the human shields, who they refer to as, I think I'm pronouncing it properly, shawish, which is an informal slang for low-ranking soldier, meaning those who they employ to serve as a human shield are described as low-ranking soldiers, of course, against their will. And the process was described by several eyewitnesses. What did you make of those allegations?
Well, I think it's an absolutely vital report, and while I do want to give all due credit to Breaking the Silence for having produced this report, and it must have been an extraordinary challenge for an Israeli organization to publish such a report in Israel, given the political environment there and the media censorship and all the rest of it. I also want to point out that this has been known for some time. There were already testimonies, I believe, as early as November of last year, in which Palestinians whose testimony was collected by the Palestinian Journalist Syndicate in the Gaza Strip were indicating that they had been, in one case, the claim was that this individual had been fitted with an explosive belt. His family was taken hostage to ensure his compliance. And then he was basically shoved into a tunnel with a rope to explore it on their behalf. This was an anonymous testimony that couldn't be verified. But then earlier this year, Al Jazeera conducted its own investigation and came to conclusions that have now been confirmed in the report by Breaking the Silence by the perpetrators themselves, the soldiers who actually commit these crimes. Now, I think it's important to note that the use of human shields by the Israeli military has been a very long-standing practice. And one reason we know this and that it can't be dismissed as blood libel or whatever the term, anti-Semitism or whatever term they use these days, by Israel's apologists and flunkies, one reason they can't make this accusation is because there was a case before this Israeli Supreme Court, I believe in 2005, so almost 2 decades ago, in which Israel's use of human shields was challenged. At the time, it was called the neighborhood procedure, and it means you grab any kid or passing civilian off the street, point a gun to his head, and force them to enter into a building to ensure that it's safe. Well, the Israeli military, as an institution, made a plea to the Supreme Court to allow it to continue with this practice. So it's a little difficult to deny that this practice ever existed. But now we're at a whole other level. According to this report, it's a routine practice. One of the excuses being given, back to the issue of dehumanization we were discussing earlier, is that too many dogs have died in exploring tunnels. And what has been happening here is that Palestinians have been fitted with Israeli military uniforms, sent into tunnels with cameras and whatever, basically not being just used as human shields, but being used as cannon fodder, being used to draw anticipated fire from Palestinian fighters who may be in those tunnels, or to set off booby traps that may be in those tunnels. And the other, I think, key revelation in this report is that, as we were just discussing about the settlers, this is not the case of a few bad apples. We're talking here about something that goes all the way up the chain of command, that has been endorsed by officers, and according to this report, is being done with the knowledge of the Israeli military's chief of staff, Halevi. So again, this can't be dismissed as, blood libel, anti-Semitism, blah, 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 on the one hand. And this also can't be assigned to just a few individuals who are acting in contravention of orders or policy. These are the orders, and this is the policy.
Can I just ask you a question about the actual definition of human shield itself? Because
Yes.
Israel uses it a lot, accuses Palestinians of using it a lot. So there is a human shields is a specific term, has a legal definition.
Yes.
And as far as I understand it, it's forcefully recruiting a civilian and getting the civilian to do what soldiers are meant to do. But is there is there any evidence though that the Palestinians are actually doing that? Just uh, finding, for example, weapons underground on top of a school. That's not really the legal definition of a human shield. Human shield specifically means
Yes.
employing the service of a civilian forcefully to do a military job. Isn't that what it is?
Yes, well, it's a little broader than that. The definition, the legal definition of a human shield must involve an element of coercion. So, let's say, for the sake of argument, that Palestinian fighters enter a home or a school or a hospital while armed. Yes, they would be recklessly endangering the lives of those who are there, but that would only meet the definition of a human shield if the civilians who were there, let's say, tried to flee out of fear that that location would be bombed, and then they would be barred forcefully by the armed men who entered that location. So, the types of Israeli practices we've been describing are certainly human shields. Another is where Israeli soldiers will enter a building and, let's say, put a family in one room and force them to stay there while carrying out military operations, or forcing a member of that family to stand in front of a window in the hope that Palestinian fighters would then not open fire on that building. But for a armed fighter to merely be in the presence of civilians is not in and of itself, does not meet the definition of a human shield. You can say a lot about it, but it's not a human shield. Of course, Israel's definition is, well, because Hamas is in the Gaza Strip, the entire population of the Gaza Strip is deliberately being used as human shields, and therefore we are perfectly within our right to exterminate them. That's not how it works.
Let's turn our attention to the latest trip by US Secretary of State Antony Blinken to Israel. Of course, to thresh out ceasefire agreements. What's the latest on that front?
Well, it's a bit of a long story, so bear with me while I go through the details. So I believe it was on the 29th of May that US President Joe Biden publicly presented what he referred to as a ceasefire initiative that, according to Biden, had been formulated not by the US government, but by none other than the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. I think the hope and expectation was that Hamas would reject this initiative, and Israel and the US could then say, well, we presented an initiative in good faith. The terrorists have rejected it, so they leave us with no choice but to continue our genocidal campaign in the Gaza Strip. What happened is that on July the 2nd, Hamas actually accepted that initiative. And then the United Nations Security Council endorsed that initiative. So that left the US and Israel in kind of a hard spot. The purpose of this entire ceasefire charade, to put it bluntly, had not been to achieve a ceasefire, but to create the impression of negotiations and movement towards a ceasefire in order to legitimize what was actually happening on the ground, which is that the US armed and supplied and supported Israeli military was conducting a genocide against the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. And I've compared it to the Oslo process during the 1990s, the purpose of which was not to reach a peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinians, but the purpose of which was to serve as kind of a buffer against any effort to hold Israel to account for its actions. It was to serve as a fig leaf for the continuation of settlement expansion and Israeli annexation and the consolidation of Israeli rule. So the entire purpose of the project was process rather than agreement. But I digress. So what subsequently happened is of course Israel conducted these two high-profile assassinations of a senior Hezbollah military commander in Beirut and of the head of the Hamas Politburo in Tehran. And both Iran and Hezbollah vowed that they would retaliate and that the reprisals would be direct and painful. So that all of a sudden made the need for the illusion of diplomatic process urgent again, seen from Washington and Israel's perspective. So the US, hoping that in renewing this process and holding new negotiations, it would stave off a Iranian or Hezbollah or axis of resistance retaliation, because these actors would not want to take responsibility for sabotaging a genuine effort to reach a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip. And that's the context in which we should understand these latest talks. And the problem is that if you have a ceasefire initiative that has been announced by the US, formulated by Israel, endorsed by the UN Security Council, and accepted by Hamas, well, then it's going to be very difficult to have a process as opposed to simply implementing what everyone has already agreed to. So what did the US do? It said, well, we will put forward a bridging proposal. Israel put forward a slew of new conditions that were not part of the May initiative that had been accepted by Hamas. And lo and behold, the bridging proposal includes entirely new elements that have now been rejected by Hamas, that have not been accepted by Israel because it doesn't include all of Israel's new demands. So now you have the basis for an indefinite process to indefinitely negotiate a ceasefire that is not intended to be achieved. I think the problem for Israel and the US is that in the initial talks last week, Iran and Hezbollah, of course, did not want to take the blame for the consequences of responding to Israel and therefore held back. I think by now it's eminently clear that this entire process is a sham, and neither neither Iran nor Hezbollah will take this process into account in making any political decisions about if, how, when, and where to retaliate for Israel's high-profile assassinations a few weeks ago.
So so that explains partly the delay, I think, in Iran not launching strike in response to Israel's assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Iran, I think over 2 weeks ago. So from your point of view, do you think Iran is demonstrating a kind of moral restraint and being a more rational political actor than Israel, which seems to want to escalate and bait Iran into a regional conflict? Iran does not seem to have taken the bait and instead is seeking to see some kind of a resolution, a ceasefire agreement in exchange. Rather than strike Israel directly, does that not make Iran a more rational actor in your point of view?
Well, I would argue the comparison shouldn't be with Iran. The comparison can be with anyone. I mean, there really is no more irrational actor on the world stage today than Israel, and that holds true whether you compare it with Iran or really any other state that I can think of. I'm not sure I would characterize Iran's position as restraint. Um, it's more that this coalition known as the Axis of Resistance has indicated that its support fronts, as they call them, would be demobilized the moment that a ceasefire is reached in the Gaza Strip. They have also said that their retaliation for these Israeli assassinations will be conducted independently and of developments in the Gaza Strip, even if there is a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip. So within that context, they chose not to retaliate for the assassinations during the week when intensive negotiations were being held purportedly to finalize a ceasefire agreement by means of a U.S. bridging proposal. And so they gave, from their perspective, these talks a fair chance to result in a ceasefire, and would then choose if and how to retaliate against Israel once that ceasefire had been achieved. In other words, they wanted to avoid being the party that undermined the prospect for a ceasefire. I think by now it's clear this entire process is a sham and a charade, and is serving as a fig leaf um, for its real purpose, which is to seek to prevent retaliation against Israel. And as for what they will do, I suspect, this is again pure speculation. I suspect that in the case of Hezbollah, there's going to be a direct blow against Israel of whatever nature. In the case of Iran, that may not necessarily be the case. In the case of Iran, it may determine that the best response against the nuclear power that is Israel would be for Iran itself to cross the nuclear threshold and develop a nuclear weapon of its own. And of course, in the past, when Israelis have become all hysterical about the prospect of an Iranian nuclear weapon, and you ask them, well, what about Israel's nuclear arsenal? The response would be, well, we're a rational state. We would never use these weapons unless our very existence was threatened. Well, just in the past year, you've had serving cabinet ministers, not only you've had serving cabinet ministers advocating the use of nuclear weapons against the Gaza Strip. You've had numerous Israeli leaders suggesting coyly between the lines that these nuclear weapons can be used against Iran if there's further escalation. The Times of Israel recently quoted what it described as a senior American official warning Iran that if it retaliates against Israel, this will have a cataclysmic effect, terms that are usually reserved for weapons of mass destruction. So the idea that it's okay for Israel to have nuclear weapons because it's a rational state, but Iran is somehow an irrational actor that should never be allowed to possess these weapons. Well, I think, you know, um, uh, that's that's uh, um, that's an approach that needs revisiting. Uh, and in my view, what these past weeks have demonstrated is that in this rivalry, there is indeed a rational and an irrational actor, but it's quite the opposite of what we've been presented with.
Yeah, I think you're perfectly right in your assessment of that. Another story last week that grabbed a lot of attention is revelations by Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman about the normalization, supposed normalization with Israel and the Israel, sorry. That story had gone cold for a number of months, as far as I recall. At the beginning, there was speculation that Israel would normalize or Saudi would normalize despite the genocide in Gaza. Uh, Maybe these were just leaks from the Israeli side. I don't know. But there had been no discussion about that since, as far as I recall, until last week. Bin Salman came out and said that he actually fears assassination if he pushes ahead with normalization with Israel. He said that to visiting US Congress members to Riyadh. And to me, that underscored, the view that even dictators in the Middle East have, to some degree, listen to their public. And of course, he is bringing up the specter of the assassination of King Faisal many years back. So there are important considerations for Mohammed bin Salman, and I think one of the uh, big realization is probably that he's not doing this for the sake of the Palestinians, but I think the big realization for a lot of the Arab regimes is that they cannot simply leap over the Palestinian issue. And do you think bin Salman is also under that realization, where that he can no longer make peace with Israel by leapfrogging over the Palestinians, and he actually realizes that there is genuine threat to his life if he does so, because Saudi society is fractured. It's not. It is tribal, and beneath the surface there is a lot of resentment towards him, and those resentment could boil over. So, what did you make of that story?
Well, first of all, you're entirely correct when you say that autocrats can't simply ignore public opinion because they don't have elections. I mean, public opinion matters everywhere. And, if you want to look at autocratic leaders who have been assassinated over this issue, well, of course, most prominently, Anwar al-Sadat, and he was not the only one in this respect. Uh,
Rabin?
yeah, Rabin, of course, although he was an elected leader. And then in the 1950s, you had the current Jordanian monarch's great-grandfather, King Abdullah I. So, in that context, it's entirely understandable that Mohammed bin Salman would make this statement, particularly because Saudi public opinion is known to be very engaged politically, and this is among the most prominent issues that has historically concerned the Saudi public. Now, having said that, why he made that statement and in what context is a little less clear. It would appear that he was coming under pressure or efforts at persuasion by either American officials or visiting U.S. congressmen, as you indicated, basically saying, yeah, just Netanyahu is not going to agree to anything regarding a Palestinian state. So given that reality, why don't you just normalize relations with Israel anyway? And I suspect it was in a context somewhat similar to that Hamad bin Salman then responded, well, if I were to normalize relations with Israel in the absence of credible guarantees that this would result in a Palestinian state, then I'm endangering my own life. But I think the broader context in which this also needs to be understood is that for Saudi Arabia, the real prize in such a deal has nothing to do with Israel. It's everything about the bilateral relationship in the with the United States and the strengthening of that relationship. And the only reason Israel figures into this is because that's coming at U.S. insistence. And so, in that sense, I think another message that bin Salman is trying to send is look, I can't do this part of the deal without endangering my life. And the reason is because you Americans are letting Israel have its merry way with the annexation of the West Bank. So let's forget about Israel and the Palestinians for the time being and focus instead on the US Saudi bilateral relationship and move that forward. I suspect that's the background to the story. But of course, the U.S. will not enter into an agreement that serves U.S. strategic interests in the Middle East and in its relationship with Saudi Arabia unless Israel's needs are attended to first.
Let's finish with a story from my part of the world here in the UK, where last week, recently, a British Foreign Office official, Mark Smith, he resigned over what he described as UK complicity in war crimes in Gaza. And he went on to say in his letter of resignation that there is no justification for UK's continued arms sales to Israel, yet it still continues. And he complained that this concern is not a concern that he is expressing by himself. There are as many as, he didn't say this, but there are supposedly as many as 300 staff in the Foreign Office who had informally raised concerns of Britain's complicity in support of Israel's genocide. And I think we've spoken about how civil servants in the US are resigning. This is, as far as I can recall, the first example of a civil servant here in the UK who understands the whole process of arms sales and the implications and the legal implications to have resigned. And I think the question, I guess, is, I mean, do you think this is as a result of civil servants recognizing that they could be now prosecuted for genocide because it's now moved on so far ahead, and this train is speeding ahead, and they are fearful that they will be taken to court for their complicity in signing arms deals with Israel?
I think with civil servants who take such decisions, it's always it's inherently difficult to determine their ultimate motives. It's certainly plausible that they were acting primarily out of a sense of self-preservation, as you suggest, and ensuring that they themselves are not held legally responsible for policies decided by their political superiors. It's also possible that such individuals maintain the belief or hope or expectation, illusion perhaps, that from their position within the bureaucracy, that they could ultimately, by continually issuing warnings and so on, that this would change the policy, and that after a certain amount of time and realizing that there is nothing they can do to impact the policy, that their sole role would be to implement the policy, that they decided they could no longer do this. In other cases, it just so fundamentally violates an individual's sense of morality and political responsibility and all the rest of it, that they resign. So I really don't want to speculate on the specific motivations of this or indeed any other particular case, but I will make the general observation that in the context of genocide and growing accusations of direct complicity by states that are continuing to supply weapons to the genocidal Israeli regime, particularly the United States, Germany, and the UK, it wouldn't surprise me at all to learn that some element of warding off legal consequences may well have entered into the mix.
Thank you, Moin. That wraps up another episode of Memo's Week Review. Sorry, with me, Nasim Ahmed, and my regular guest, Moin Rabbani. And thank you for tuning in. See you all next week for another episode of Memo Review. Goodbye.